Chapter 4. Apotheosis can be rather unnerving. Even the most hardened and cynical royal visitor to remote islands is taken aback to find the islanders worshipping his framed photograph, and he at least has the consolation of knowing that he isn't really a god. Malcolm had no such consolation as he faced up to the fact that his mind controlled the world. If only, he kept on saying to himself, Mr. Scanlan knew. Mr. Scanlan had tried to teach him physics at school, and if his assessment of Malcolm's mental capacities had been correct, the world was in deep trouble. Certainly the weight of the evidence had always seemed to be on Mr. Scanlan's side. Nevertheless, it was necessary to make the best of a bad job. Malcolm now had literally no one to blame but himself, and the daily service on the radio seemed to be directly addressed to him, especially one line, which Malcolm took it upon himself to paraphrase slightly. "For there is none other that fighteth for us, but only thou, O God." But the news from the outside world gave him grounds for cautious optimism. The disasters that had marked his accession cleared themselves up with embarrassing speed. The United Nations, for example, held a very special session in New York and unanimously voted to levy an unprecedented contribution from all its members to relieve the suffering of the victims of the catastrophe. The various coups and revolutions resolved themselves into benign democracies as if that had been their intention all along. America and China started playing each other at ping-pong again, and the swarm of locusts was devoured by a huge flock of migrating birds. Admittedly, England lost the second test as well, but Malcolm knew he could not be expected to work miracles. The only disaster that had been reported was the destruction by volcanic forces of a small uninhabited atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and even that had its good side, as the residents of the neighbouring atoll had always complained that it was an eyesore and spoilt their view of the sunset. It needed no ghost come from the grave, and no visitation of prophetic birds to tell Malcolm that this was all the result of being nice. He had rigorously excluded from his mind all unpleasant, spiteful, or angry thoughts for the best part of a fortnight. The strain was beginning to show, and the result had been a quite unparalleled upturn in the fortunes of the human race. And all that, Malcolm reflected smugly, was me. But it was extremely frustrating to have to keep all this to oneself. Malcolm had never achieved anything before, except third prize in a village flower show when he was 9. 3 people had entered that particular category, and the wish to be congratulated was very strong. His sister, for example, had achieved many things, but she had never stopped a war or disposed of a swarm of locusts. But the ring seemed to cut him off from the rest of the human race. Although he was the master of the Tarnhelm, he scarcely went out at all. This was partly laziness, partly caution, for if he was to remain nice and keep his mind free of malice or resentment, it would not be advisable for him to see any of his friends or relatives. He was also beginning to feel extremely hungry. All the food lying about the flat, some of which had been there for a considerable time, was long since finished. He had no money left, and he could see little prospect of getting any more. Even if his job still existed, and after 2 weeks' unexplained absence that seemed unlikely, he knew that for the sake of mankind he could not go back to it. One cannot work as a clerk in a provincial auction room without entertaining some fairly dark thoughts, any one of which, given his present position, could blot out a major city. The obvious alternative, theft, using the power of the Tarnhelm, was open to the same objections. If he were to start stealing things, who could tell what the consequences might be? He contemplated the problem, turning himself into Aristotle in the hope that the transformation might assist his powers of reasoning. During the past 2 weeks, metamorphosis had been virtually his only occupation, and had kept him moderately amused. He had always rather wanted to know what various characters from history and fiction really looked like, especially the girls described by the poets. He also took the trouble to assume the shapes of all his likely assailants, Wotan and Alberic and Logi, so as to be able to recognise them instantly, and had almost frightened himself half to death in the process. The outward shape of Aristotle seemed to inspire him, and he went through the various ways in which he could sell gold for money without actually getting involved himself. Having dismissed the notion of putting out an advertisement in the classified section of the Quantock Gazette, he hit upon what seemed to be an acceptable notion. Armed with a large suitcase, he commanded the Tarnhelm to take him to some uninhabited vault in the Bank of England, where he might find plenty of used banknotes. On arrival, he filled the suitcase, more of a small trunk, with 10 and 20-pound notes, then started to materialise gold to a roughly equivalent value. By the time he had finished, his forehead was quite sore with rubbing, and the floor of the vault was covered in exquisite treasures. He removed himself and the suitcase, and tried the equivalent banks in France, America, Australia, and other leading countries, for it would be unfair if only 1 or 2 countries suddenly found themselves linked to the gold standard. With the immense wealth he gathered in this way, he opened a large number of bank accounts in various names, a terrifying business full of unforeseen complications, and bought himself the house he had always wanted, a huge and extremely attractive manor house near Taunton, which happened to be for sale. As he had anticipated, no mention was made by any of the financial institutions with which he had done business of the sudden disappearance of large sums of money, or the equally unexpected appearance of a fortune in gold. The price of the metal fluctuated wildly for a day or so, then went considerably higher than it had been for some time. Intrigued, Malcolm revisited his favourite banks, invisible and carrying 2 suitcases. All the gold had gone, and there were plenty more banknotes, neatly packaged up for ease of transportation. In the National Bank of Australia, there was even a piece of card with "Thanks, please call again" written on it, propped up on a shelf. Now that he was a multi-millionaire on both sides of the Iron Curtain, Malcolm turned his attention to furnishing his new house. It seemed likely that he would have to spend a great deal of time in it, on his own, and since money was no object, he decided to have the very best of everything. It was obvious that he could not risk appearing there in his own shape. What would Malcolm Fisher be doing buying Combe Hall? And so he designed for himself a new persona to go with his new life. In doing so, he made a terrible mistake, but by the time he realised what he had done, it was too late. It was simple carelessness on his part that caused the trouble. He had been so excited at the prospect of owning Combe Hall that he had gone to the estate agents who were handling the sale in his own shape. He was shown into an office and asked to wait while the senior partner came down to see him, and as the door opened to admit this gentleman, Malcolm caught sight of his own original face in the mirror and realised his mistake. He commanded the Tarnhelm to change him into someone else, but did not have the time to specify who. To his horror, he saw that the face in the mirror was that of the most handsome man, but the estate agents had seen him now, so he could not change into anything less conspicuous. He had stuck like it, just as his mother had warned him he would. Thus it was that Malcolm found himself condemned to embark on his new life with the face and body of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer, also known as the most handsome man. He could not help remembering the pigeon's warning about this, but it was too late now. Not that Malcolm objected in principle to being the most handsome man who had ever lived, but the sight of ravens, or crows, or blackbirds, he was no ornithologist, filled him with horror. Meanwhile, he fleshed out his new character, and by deviousness and contrivance of which he had not thought himself capable, acquired the necessary documents and paperwork. In order to give his new self a history, multimillionaires do not simply appear from nowhere, he had to Tarnhelm himself at dead of night into the computer rooms of half the public records offices in the country, and since he knew next to nothing about 20th century machines, he accidentally erased the life histories of several hundred people before getting the result he wanted. Finally, however, he ended up with everything he needed to be Herr Manfred Finger of Dusseldorf, the name and identity he had chosen. Again, the German aspect was ill-advised and unintentional. He had wanted to be a foreigner of some sort, since in Somerset it is understood that all foreigners are mad, and allowances for eccentric or unusual behaviour are made accordingly, and had chosen a country at random. That he had chosen Germany was either yet more carelessness, or else the ring trying to get its own back on him for making it do good in the world. He was not sure which, but was inclined to the first explanation, as being more in keeping with his own nature. Airfinger was soon familiar to all the inhabitants of Combe, who were naturally curious to know more about their new neighbour. As local custom demanded, they soon found a nickname for the new lord of the manor. The various members of the Booth family, who had owned the hall from the early Tudor period onwards, had all been known by a variety of affectionate epithets, Mad Jack or Drunken George, and the periphrasis bestowed upon Malcolm was that rich foreign bastard. Such familiarity did not, however, imply acceptance. Although it was generally admitted that Airfinger was not too bad on the surface, and no worse than the last of the Booths, Sir William or Daft Billy, it went without saying that there was something wrong about him. He was, it was agreed, a criminal of some sort, but whether he was an illegal arms dealer or a drug smuggler, the sages of Combe could not be certain. The only thing on which everyone was unanimous was that he had murdered his wife. After all, none of them had ever seen her in the village. "And what time," said Wotan, "do you call this?" Logie, his hands covered in oil, climbed wearily off his motorcycle and removed his helmet. "It broke down again," he said. "It's just outside Wuppertal. Plugs." Wotan shook his head sadly. Admittedly, it had been on his orders that the immortal gods had traded in their 8-legged horses and chariots drawn by winged cats for forms of transport more suited to the 20th century, but he expected his subordinates to be both punctual and properly turned out. Cleanliness, he was fond of asserting, is next to godliness. "Well, you're here now," he said. "So what do you make of that?" Logie looked about him. There was nothing to see except cornfields. He said so. "Well done," growled Wotan. "We are unusually observant this morning, are we not? And what do you find unusual about the corn in these cornfields?" Logie scratched his head, getting oil on his hair. "Dunno," he said. "It looks perfectly normal to me." "Normal for August?" "Perfectly." "It's June." Logie, who had spent an hour wrestling with a motorcycle engine beside a busy autobahn, did not at first appreciate the significance of this remark. Then the pfennig dropped. "It's 2 months in advance, you mean?" "Precisely." Wotan put his arm around Logie's shoulder. "Good, wouldn't you say?" "I suppose so." "It's bloody marvellous, considering the weather they've been having this year. And why do you suppose the crops are doing so very, very well? In fact, why is everything in the world doing so very, very well? Answer me that." Logie instinctively looked up at the sky. Thunderclouds were beginning to form. "Someone's been interfering?" he suggested. "Correct!" Wotan shouted, and the first clap of thunder came in dead on cue. "Someone's been interfering. Now, who could that be? Who on earth could be responsible for this new golden age?" From his tone, Logie guessed that it couldn't have been Wotan himself, which left only one candidate. "You mean the ring-bearer?" "Very good. The only force in the universe capable of making things happen so quickly and so thoroughly. But isn't that a trifle strange in itself? Wouldn't you expect the ring to do nasty things, not nice ones? Left to itself, I mean." Logie agreed that he would. "So you would agree that anyone capable of making the ring do what it doesn't want to do is likely to be a rather special person?" Wotan had picked up this irritating habit of asking leading questions from the late and unlamented Socrates. Logie hated it. "In fact, someone so remarkable that even if he didn't have the ring, he would present a serious danger to our security. And since he does have the ring..." Wotan was trembling with rage, and the rain was falling fast, beating down on the standing corn. "We have to find him, quickly," he roared. "Otherwise, we are in grave danger. To be precise, you have to find him. Do you understand? Logie understood, but Wotan wanted to make his point. And if I were you, my friend, I would spare no effort in looking for him. I would leave no stone unturned and no avenue unexplored. And do you know why? Because if you don't, you might very well find yourself spending the rest of eternity as a waterfall. You wouldn't like that now, would you? Logie agreed that he wouldn't, and Wotan was about to develop this theme further when it stopped raining. The clouds dispersed and the sun shone brightly, pitching a vivid rainbow across the blue sky. "Who said you could stop raining?" screamed Wotan. "I want lightning! Now!" The sky took no notice, and Logie went white with fear. Everyone has his own particular phobia, and Logie was terrified of fish. As a waterfall, he would have salmon jumping up him all day long. He would have prayed for rain if he wasn't a god himself. But the sky remained cloudless. "That does it!" Wotan smashed his fist into the palm of his left hand. "When I'm not even allowed to rain my own rain because it damages the crops, it's time for positive action." He stood still for a moment, then turned to Logie. "Are you still here?" he asked savagely. "I'm on my way," Logie replied, jumping desperately on the kickstart of his motorcycle. "I'll find him, don't you worry." Logie sped off into the distance, and Wotan was left alone, staring angrily at the sun. 2 coal-black ravens floated down and settled on the fence. "Nice weather we're having," said Thought. For some reason, this did not go down well. "Any result?" Wotan snapped. "Nothing so far, boss," said Memory. "Where have you been looking?" "Everywhere, boss, but you know we can't find the ring bearer. We can't see him, or read his thoughts, or anything like that." "God give me strength." Wotan clenched his fist and made an effort to relax. "Then what you do, you stupid bird, is go through all of the people of the world, one by one, and when you find the one whose thoughts you can't read and who you can't see, that's him. I'd have thought that was obvious." Thought looked at Memory. Memory looked at Thought. "But that'll take weeks, boss," said Memory. "So what else were you planning to do?" The 2 ravens flapped their wings and launched themselves into the air. They circled for a moment, then floated over the world. All day they flew, sweeping in wide circles across the continents, until Memory suddenly swooped down and landed beside the banks of the Rhine. "Stuff this," he said to Thought. "Why don't we ask the girls?" "Good idea," said Memory. "Wish I'd thought of that." "It must have slipped your mind." The 2 birds took off again, but this time they flew only a mile or so, to a spot where, about 1,000 years ago, a certain Alberic had stopped and watched 3 beautiful women swimming in the river. The ravens landed in a withered tree and folded their wings. Under the tree, 3 young girls were sunbathing, and for them the sun goddess had saved the best of the evening light, for she was their friend. "Flosshilda," said one of the girls, "there's a raven in that tree looking at you." "I hope he likes what he sees," replied the Rhine daughter lazily. Welgunda, the eldest and most serious of the 3, rolled onto her stomach and lifted her designer sunglasses. "Hello, Thought," she said. "Hello, Memory. Found him yet, then?" The ravens were silent, ruffling their coarse feathers with their beaks, and the girls giggled. "But you've been looking for simply ages," said Woglinda, the youngest and most frivolous of the 3. "It must be somewhere." "I'm always losing things," said Flosshilda. "Where do you last remember seeing it?" "You sure it's not in your pocket?" "You've put it somewhere safe and you can't remember where?" Wotan's ravens had been putting up with this sort of thing for 1,000 years, but it still irritated them. The girls laughed again, and Memory blushed under his feathers. "If you don't find him soon," yawned Flosshilda, combing her long golden hair, "he'll slip through your claws just like clever old Ingolf did. By the way, fancy Ingolf being a badger." "He'll get the hang of the Tarnhelm and then no one will ever find him," purred Woglinda. "What a shame that would be." Good luck to him, said Wogunda. Who wants the boring old ring anyway?
Dunno what you're being so bloody funny about, said Memory. Supposed to be your ring we're looking for.
Forget it, said Woglinda, waving her slender arms. It's a lovely day, the sun is shining, the crops are growing. Memory winced at this. Flosshilda giggled. And it's been so long since Alberic took the beastly thing that we don't really care anymore, do we? Woglinda wiggled her toes attractively in a way that had suggested something far nicer than measureless wealth for thousands of years. What do we want with gold when we have you to entertain us?
Save it for the human beings, said Memory.
I wonder what he looks like, said Wogunda. I bet you he's handsome. And strong. And noble. Don't forget noble. I never could resist noble, said Woglinda, watching the ravens carefully under her beautiful eyelashes.
We came to tell you that we'd heard something, said Thought. But since you're not interested anymore...
Wogunda yawned, putting her hand daintily in front of her mouth. You're right, she said. We're not. She turned over onto her back and picked up a magazine.
Something interesting we've heard, said Memory.
Oh, all right, said Flosshilda, smiling her most dazzling smile. Tell us, if you must. Even Wotan's ravens, who are, firstly, immortal, and, secondly, birds, cannot do much against the smiles of Rhine daughters. But since Memory was bluffing, there was nothing for him to do.
I didn't say we were going to tell you what we'd heard, he said archly, only that we'd heard it.
It is not easy for a raven to be arch, but Memory had been practicing. Oh, go away, said Flosshilda, throwing a piece of orange peel at the two messengers. You're teasing us as usual.
You wait and see, said Memory lamely.
But the three girls jumped up and dived into the water as elegantly as the very best dolphins. We know something you don't know, chanted Flosshilda, and the sun goddess made the water sparkle around her floating hair. Then she disappeared, leaving behind only a stream of silver bubbles.
I dunno, said Thought. Women.
The ravens flapped their heavy wings, circled morosely for a while, and flew away. By a strange coincidence, a few moments after Flosshilda dived down into the bed of the Rhine, 3 identical girls hopped out of the muddy, fetid waters of the River Tone, at the point where it runs through the centre of Taunton. A few passers-by stopped and stared, for the 3 girls were far cleaner than anyone who has recently had anything to do with the Tone has any right to be. But the girls' smiles wiped such thoughts from their minds, and they went on their way, whistling and wishing they were 20 years younger. Had they realised that what they had just seen were the 3 Rhine daughters, Flosshilda, Wogunda, and Woglinda, they might perhaps have taken a little more notice.